Chapter 4. The Grand Theory. The first three chapters offer a mind-boggling vision of resources. The more we use, the better off we become, and there's no practical limit to improving our lot forever. Indeed, throughout history, new tools and new knowledge have made resources easier and easier to obtain. Our growing ability to create new resources has more than made up for temporary setbacks due to local resource exhaustion, pollution, population growth, and so on. Is there some fundamental reason why this should be so? After I investigated case after case of phenomena which the doomsters said were getting worse because of increasing scarcity and population growth, and found instead that they were getting better, as you will see in the chapters to come, it came to seem no accident. I even began to be rather sure in advance that I would find improvement rather than deterioration, and though I knew I had to check out each case, I began to worry that I might fall into error by assuming that a mere coincidence is a general rule. So I began to wonder whether there is a deep connection, a general theory that embraces all these phenomena, and I believe that there is. Let us begin by going beyond the trends in particular resources. The greatest and most important trend of which these particular trends are a part is the trend of this earth becoming ever more livable for human beings. We see the signs of this in our longer life expectancy, improved knowledge of nature, and greater ability to protect ourselves from the elements, living with ever more safety and comfort. But though this larger trend buttresses the particular resource trends, it still provides no causal explanation of the phenomenon we seek to understand. Evolutionary thinking, however, and more specifically in economics, the sort of analysis suggested by Friedrich Hayek, offers an explanation of the observed long-term trend. Hayek, following upon Hume, urges upon us that humankind has evolved sets of rules and patterns of living which are consistent with survival and growth rather than with decline and extinction, an aspect of the evolutionary selection for survival among past societies. He assumes that the particular rules and living patterns have had something to do with chances for survival. For example, he reasons that patterns leading to higher fertility and more healthful and productive living have led to groups' natural increase and hence survival, and therefore the patterns we have inherited constitute a machinery for continued survival and growth where conditions are not too different from the past. This is consistent with a biological view of humankind as having evolved genes that point toward survival. But no such genetic evolution is presupposed by Hayek, in part because its time span is too great for us to understand it as well as we can understand the evolution of cultural rules. It may be illuminating, however, to view mankind's biological nature as part of the long evolutionary chain dating from the simplest plants and animals, a history of increasing complexity of construction and greater capacity to deal actively with the environment. Let us apply Hayek's general analysis to natural resources. Such resources of all sorts have been a part of human history ever since the beginning. If humankind had not evolved patterns of behavior that increased rather than decreased the amounts of resources available to us, we would not still be here. If, as our numbers increased, or even as our numbers remained nearly stationary, our patterns had led to diminished supplies of plants and animals, less flint for tools, and disappearing wood for fires and construction, I would not be here to be writing these pages, and you would not be here to be reading them. What are the key patterns that maintained us and increased our numbers? Certainly, the evolved cultural patterns include voluntary exchange between individuals and the market that humankind has evolved to provide resources in increasing quantities, institutions, such as schools that pass on knowledge, libraries and legends and storytellers that store knowledge, and monasteries and laboratories and R&D departments that produce knowledge. The evolved biological patterns include the hunger signals we get when we lack food, and the attention that we focus on apparent regularities in nature, such as the annual cycle of seasons when they appear before us. But ignorance of these cultural and biological patterns is not devastating for us, and such ignorance ought not to be surprising, given the complexity of these patterns and the difficulty of any one person seeing much of any pattern. Belief that our evolved history is, as I suggest, toward being creators rather than destroyers, may be strengthened by some evidence that such evolution spontaneously occurs independently within most human groups as a result of the conditions of natural life that humankind faces. People build shelters from sun, rain, and snow. The exchange mechanism evolves everywhere as a way of handling differences in abilities among persons, in order to improve our capacities to construct and create new goods, as well as to distribute existing goods. Chiefs of work gangs somehow assume their roles to enable constructive tasks to be carried out efficiently. Communities reward creators of community projects in a variety of ways that they do not reward destroyers of community resources. Warriors against other groups are not exceptions to this proposition. But perhaps it deserves mention as an exception that songs are written about such destroyers as the James Gang, as well as about such creators as John Henry. Mothers probably everywhere ooh and ah about their children's sandcastles, and reprimand the children when they kick over other children's sandcastles. And though I have no evidence and feel no need to consult anthropologists on the matter, I'd bet that early tribes gave greater honor to persons in dry climates who tended to find water than to those who polluted water sources, and greater honor to those who tended to find food effectively than to those who showed considerable ability to consume food supplies. Our whole evolution up to this point shows that human groups spontaneously evolve patterns of behavior, as well as patterns of training people for that behavior, which tend on balance to lead people to create rather than destroy. Humans are, on net balance, builders rather than destroyers. The evidence is clear. The civilization which our ancestors have bequeathed to us contains more created works than the civilization they were bequeathed. In short, humankind has evolved into creators and problem solvers. Our constructive behavior has counted for more than our using up and destructive behavior, as seen in our increasing length of life and richness of consumption. This view of the average human as builder conflicts with the view of the average human as destroyer, which underlies the thought of many doomsdayers. From the latter view derive such statements as, the U.S. has 5% of the population and uses 40% of resources, without reference to the creation of resources by the same U.S. population. Also involved here is a view of resources as physical quantities waiting for the plucking rather than as the services that humankind derives from some combination of knowledge with physical conditions. If one notices only the using up and destructive activities of humankind, without understanding that constructive patterns of behavior must have been the dominant part of our individual cum social nature in order for us to have survived to this point, then it is not surprising that one would arrive at the conclusion that resources will grow scarcer in the future. Paradoxically, rules and customs that lead to population growth rather than to population stability or decline may be part of our inherited capacity to deal successfully with resource problems in the long run, though the added people may exacerbate the problems in the short run. Such rules and customs probably lead to long-run success of a society in two ways. First, high fertility leads to increased chances of survival of the group, ceteris paribus. The Parsis in India seem doomed to disappear in the long run due to restrictive marriage and fertility patterns, though individually they have been very successful economically. Second, high fertility leads to resource problems, which then lead to solutions to the problems which usually leave humanity better off in the long run than if the problems had never arisen. Third, in a more direct chain of events, rules and customs leading to high fertility fit together with the positive effect of additional people on productivity, both through the demand for goods and through the supply of ingenious minds that I discuss at length in recent books. However, even if one accepts that humankind has evolved into a creator rather than a destroyer, it is certainly not unreasonable to wonder whether there have been changes in conditions or one or more structural changes in patterns of social behavior that might point to a change in the positive trend, just as there might have been environmental changes in the case of the dinosaurs or structural changes among some human groups that have disappeared. Change in natural conditions sometimes has affected cultural evolution, but possible internal contradictions in a society or economy are more relevant to the present context. This concept represents the intuitive notion that because of our population size and growth rate, and because of the way we produce goods and are organized socially, our civilization is unwieldy and hence must collapse of its own weight by, for example, nuclear destruction or the failure of a single all-important crop. Many who are pessimistic about the outcome of the present course of civilization suggest that the externalities of pollution are such an internal contradiction that will do us in. Some political organizations and devices have evolved to deal with the matter, and we have both public and private cleanup and collection of various kinds of garbage, as well as laws that regulate pollution behavior. But the possible changes in pollutions and the recency of the onset of regulatory activities certainly leave room to wonder whether we have yet evolved reliable patterns of dealing with pollution problems. Intergenerational relationships with respect to resources are another frequently mentioned possible internal contradiction. That is, one generation exploiting a resource and leaving too little for the next generation. Futures markets, both those that buy and sell the resources themselves and those that sell and buy the shares of resource-supplying firms, have evolved to protect against this potential danger. And we have had a long enough history by now to be confident that this evolved mechanism is reliable and satisfactory for the purpose. In conclusion, I am suggesting that humankind has evolved culturally, and perhaps also genetically, in such a manner that our patterns of behavior, with social rules and customs being a crucial part of these patterns, predispose us to deal successfully with resource scarcity. This view of human history is consistent with the observed long-term trend toward greater resource availability and with the positive and growing preponderance of our creative over our exploitational activities. This view provides a causal foundation for the observed benign resource trends. It argues against our being at a turning point in resource history now, and thereby buttresses the technique of simply extrapolating from past trends that produces forecasts of increasing rather than decreasing resource availability. That is, our evolved patterns have given us greater rather than less command over resources over the centuries. The market system is part of that evolution, of course, but it is not the whole of it. The story of Robinson Crusoe, which has been badly twisted by economists, who make it a story of allocation when it is really a story of ingenuity and the use of the knowledge that he brought with him, also illustrates this point, e.g., that by this time we have developed a body of knowledge and a set of patterns which allow us to improve our resource situation rather than make it worse, even as we use resources and even in the absence of an exchange mechanism. Thus, I think we can with confidence expect to observe greater rather than less availability of resources with the passage of time, whether it be arable land or oil or whatever, just as we observe in the trends in the past. If I am correct, we now have systematic grounds to believe that we are not at a turning point in resource history caused by man's propensity to destroy rather than create. Rather, humankind is on balance creator rather than destroyer. Here we return to Figure 1.2 and ask how Earl Cook went wrong with respect to forecasting the price of mercury. Cook did exactly what I recommend. He looked at the longest possible data series, but that did not save him from error. In contrast, why did my predictions for metals prices succeed? Part of the explanation is that he paid attention to a short-run reversal in the trend. But in addition to the data, it can help to bear a general vision, a theory, if you like. My general vision is stated just above, that on balance, we create more than we use. Cook's general vision is Malthusian, that resources are finite and eventually must run out, the same vision that inspired Limits to Growth. The very different success records of Cook's and Limits to Growth's and my own forecasts provide some basis for judging which general vision is more helpful. Entropy and finiteness, the irrelevant dismal theory. Concepts of physics are frequently misused by those who become intoxicated by casual acquaintance with them. After Einstein discovered the principle of special relativity, college sophomores and trendy preachers cited the principle as proof that everything is relative. And after Heisenberg discovered the uncertainty principle, social scientists, humanists, and theologians seized on it to prove that certain kinds of human knowledge are impossible. The concept of entropy and the associated second law of thermodynamics have a long history of abuse, even by physicists who should know better. Nonsensical ideas hitched onto the second law, including the concept of energy accounting, which is discussed in the afternote to Chapter 12, are still with us, today perhaps more strongly than ever. The cover of a paperback named Entropy says, "Entropy is the supreme law of nature and governs everything we do. Entropy tells us why our existing world is crumbling." And persons, such as I, who assert that there is no known ultimate limit to population growth and human progress, are said by energy accountants to err because of our supposed ignorance of these laws of physics. The second law of thermodynamics asserts that in a closed system, please note those crucial two words, the random disorder of energy-charged particles must increase over time. The faster that the particles move, and the more energy that is used in movements and collisions, the faster the movement away from order and toward disorder. If, for example, you start with some pattern of molecules, say, two gases at opposite ends of a box, they will increasingly mix with each other and spread more uniformly throughout the box. Doomsters extrapolate from this simple idea to the belief that the more fuel that humans use in current decades, the sooner our species must come to an end for lack of energy to maintain a patterned existence. And let there be no doubt that they envision an eventual demise. The concept of the second law underlies a vision of the human condition as inexorably sliding toward the worse in the long run. Ours is a closed universe, they assume, and within such a closed system, entropy necessarily increases. Nothing can avail against this tendency toward decreasing order, increasing disorder, and a return to chaos, to the formless and shapeless void described in the first words of Genesis. This vision is emphasized in the frequent appearance of the term finite in the literature of the environmental population control movement. The vision is set forth well by the noted mathematician Norbert Wiener, who at least viewed the grim future with an attitude of Whitmanesque nobility rather than of panic. We are shipwrecked passengers on a doomed planet. Yet even in a shipwreck, human decencies and human values do not necessarily vanish, and we must make the most of them. We shall go down, but let it be in a manner to which we may look forward as worthy of our dignity. This vision is embodied in the policy recommendations for our everyday political life offered by Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen with the approval of Paul Samuelson and of Herman Daly, who urged that we should budget our energy and other resources with an eye to optimum allocation over the eons until the system runs down. The accompanying political agenda implies greater central planning and governmental control. It is not clear whether a desire to impose more control leads people to believe that the second law is the appropriate model for human activity, or whether doomsters tend to be people who fear disorder in the first place, and therefore concern themselves with constructing methods of controlling aspects of our social world so as to fight such disorder. Whichever is so, the same persons consistently invoke both sorts of ideas. The common estimated date of the fearsome end of our cosmos is 7 billion years or so from now. The doomsters say that we should therefore be taking steps right now to defer the supposed grim end. Yes, you read right. And yes, so help me, they are serious. The concept of entropy is unquestionably valid and relevant for a closed container in the laboratory. It may also be relevant for any larger entity that can reasonably be considered a closed system. But it is quite unclear where the boundaries should be drawn for discussions of the quantity of energy, or if there is any relevant boundary. It is clearly wrong to say that, as to the scarcity of matter in a closed system, such as the Earth, the issue may, in my opinion, prove in the end more critical than that of energy. The Earth is not a closed system because both energy from the Sun and matter, cosmic dust, asteroids, debris from many planets, constantly rain down on the Earth. Perhaps the solar system will prove to be an isolated system for some period in the future, conceivably for the entire life of the human species. But even then it will last perhaps 7 billion years, and the chances would seem excellent that during that span of time, humans will be in touch with other solar systems, or will find ways to convert the matter on other planets into the energy we need to continue longer. So with respect to energy, there is no practical boundary surrounding any unit of interest to us. And without such a boundary, the notion of entropy in the large is entirely irrelevant to us. At the conceptual level of the universe, and there is no reason to discuss any smaller entity in the present context of discussion, it is quite unclear whether the concept of increasing entropy is relevant. Stephen Hawking, as eminent a student of these matters as there is in the world, has gone back and forth in his thinking on whether entropy would eventually increase or decrease. His judgment hangs on such matters as whether the universe is finite and/or bounded. His present view is that space-time is finite, but the boundary condition of the universe is that it has no boundary. And he underlines the uncertainty of our knowledge by writing that I'd like to emphasize that this idea that space and time should be finite without boundary is just a proposal. And in any case, he concludes that the nature of our subjective sense of the direction of time makes the second law of thermodynamics almost trivial. These considerations, together with his assessment that the total energy of the universe is zero, because of the balance of positive and negative energies, added to Hawking's portrayal of the state of thought in physics as thoroughly unsettled on all these cosmological questions, and which may stay unsettled forever because of the difficulty of knowing how many universes there are, would seem more than enough reason to make it ridiculous for us to concern ourselves with saving energy now to stave off for a few hundred years the possible winking out of civilization 7 billion years from now. Roger Penrose, another eminent English physicist, says, "We do not know whether the universe as a whole is finite or infinite in extent, either in space or in time, though such uncertainties would appear to have no bearing whatsoever on physics at the human scale." Other physicists argue in journals about whether it is possible for life to continue forever. These comments by Hawking and Penrose should be sobering to the many persons who would like government to regulate our daily behavior on the basis of what they believe are the laws of physics. The frequent assertion that of course our resources are finite is quite inconsistent with the fact that present scientific knowledge of our physical world is extraordinarily incomplete, and probably always must be. One must wear very tight blinders not to be humbled by reading such accounts in the press, as that recent discoveries in astronomy have punctured almost flat the leading theories on how the first stars and galaxies were born. According to Stephen Moran, a spokesman for the American Astronomical Society, the field is in disarray. All the leading theories are wrong. Yet an economist and a theologian are sure enough of their understanding of the universe that they advise the government to pressure us to ride bicycles now to budget energy for the next 7 billion or so years. Boggles the mind. Though I earlier quoted Hawking in the service of my argument, I also wish to indicate an inconsistency in his thought which makes my argument even stronger. He insists firmly that the real test of science is whether it makes predictions that agree with observation. But whereas the second law implies decreasing order, from the point of view of human beings, all our observations record a long-term increase rather than a decrease in disorder, no matter what quantities we look at. The increase in complexity of living things throughout geological time and of human society throughout history are the most important examples, of course. Biologically, as is suggested by the very word evolution, the Earth has changed from a smaller number of species of simple creatures toward a larger number of complex and ordered creatures. Geologically, the activities of human beings have resulted in a greater heaping up of particular materials in concentrated piles, e.g. the gold in Fort Knox and in gold jewelry compared to the gold in streams, or the steel in buildings and junk piles compared to the iron and other ores in the ground. The history of human institutions describes ever more complex modes of organization, a more extensive body of law, richer languages, a more ramified corpus of knowledge, and a greater range of human movement throughout the universe. All this suggests more order rather than less order in the human environment with the passage of time, and hence contradicts theories of increasing entropy. Definitists assert that this empirical evidence is irrelevant because it describes only a temporary local increase in order, superimposed on the long-term decrease that they say must be taking place. And the basis for their must is their assumption about the operation of the second law. But again, all the empirical evidence shows an increase in order, which is consistent with the idea that Earth is not a closed system. Hence, Hawking's definition of science implies the conclusion that entropy will continue to decrease rather than increase in the human environment, Earth and any other planets we may choose to inhabit, as long as the laws of physics that are presently operative continue to hold. The situation resembles a couple of ants sitting on the jungle floor, hesitating to eat a leaf, lest by doing so they hasten the disappearance of the forest. One of them says, "We're only 2 small ants, and the forest is so large," but the other replies, "Yes, but what if all the ants thought that way?" and carries the day. Indeed, the ant's actual knowledge of the life cycle of the forest may not be much inferior to humans. Present knowledge of the life cycle of the set of universes that may exist, a set which may include only ours, of course. The entropy conservers assume that others do not agree with them, either due to simple ignorance of physics and the second law, or because of willful and dishonest disregard of it. Any other possibility seems unimaginable to them. As Garrett Hardin wrote to me, "I am appalled at your omission, misunderstanding, or denial of the second law of thermodynamics, conservation laws, the idea of limits." And Paul Ehrlich writes, "One wonders if Simon could not at least find a junior high school science student to review his writings." Perhaps the problem is that these biologists' own scientific armamentarium is based on the physics that is taught in junior high school, the state of the scientific art several decades ago, stripped of all subtlety and complexity. The concept of entropy simply doesn't matter for human well-being. Our earthly island of order can grow indefinitely within the universal sea of chaos. Life could even spread from Earth to other planets, other galaxies, etc., incorporating an increasing portion of the universe's matter and energy. What happens at the end of time is anybody's guess. The universe may or may not be bounded. Who cares? That's well beyond the lifetime of our sun. Logically, we should worry much more about the death of our own sun than the supposed limits imposed by entropy and the laws of physics. I urge recognition of other intellectual possibilities. Even if the second law is correct, it's only a century or so old. There is left to humanity a period perhaps 50 thillion times that long to discover new principles before the sun runs out. But as Hawking demonstrates, cosmologists are in controversy even about whether the universe should be viewed as closed or as open and expanding, which would seem to imply lack of agreement about the validity of the entropy viewpoint held by those who would have us conserve energy to forestall the universe's doom. Can it be sensible to proceed as if our present ideas will forever remain unchanged and unimproved? Here, it might be wise for the entropists to keep in mind the famous blunder of the great British physicist Lord Kelvin, of the Kelvin temperature scale, and presumably the namesake of Kelvinator refrigerators, who asserted at the turn of the century that just about every major principle of physics worth discovering had already been discovered. All that was left was to refine the measurements of the constants. At that time, just as now, it would not have been possible to guarantee that great new discoveries would be made. But the spectacular discoveries of the past century do not mean that there are fewer great discoveries in store for the next century, or for the next 70 million centuries. Discoveries, like resources, may well be infinite. The more we discover, the more we are able to discover. The case of gravity is similar to entropy here. With a bit of schooling, one can predict the course of an object released within a closed airless container in the laboratory. This has been known for hundreds of years, and we can act safely on the basis of this knowledge. But predicting the trajectory of, say, 3 objects in space, or the fate of anything in a black hole, still confounds the most learned physicists, and it would be foolish to make major policy decisions on the basis of such controversial assessments. Those who view some body of knowledge as unshakable might keep in mind the amusing and not so amusing switches in scientific views that have occurred historically. A few examples: theories of the shape of the Earth, medical doctrine about leaching, belief that the elements are inviolate and that one metal cannot be transmuted into another, derision heaped on the microorganism theory of disease, and the shift within just a few years from dentists advising hard toothbrushes in an up and down motion to advising soft brushes in a horizontal motion. Indeed, a casual reading of lay science magazines shows that physicists are manufacturing new and competing theories of the cosmos at a very rapid rate. Just a few stray snippets. For more than a decade now, the nascent field of particle astrophysics has grown like a garden gone wild. Or astronomers go up against the Great Wall. The discovery of this huge structure could undermine cold dark matter theory of galaxy formation. But what is the alternative? And physicist David Laser argues that there is an indeterminacy set down in the order of things. He formulates what he calls the strong cosmological principle against starker interpretations of the second law, arguing that even at the origin of the universe, indeterminacy played an essential role. Evolution becomes then an open rather than a closed system, offering always the possibility of freedom and surprise. Laser's conclusion is optimistic. The new scientific worldview assures us that there are no limits to what we and our descendants can hope to achieve and to become. Conclusion: evolution, not entropy, is the appropriate theory for human development. The following chapters in Part 1 look at particular resources, documenting case after case of the general rule.